Script here with another video. I just find this so fascinating that we have this information from Gary Kurtz, who worked very, very closely with George Lucas from the very, very beginning on the Star Wars movies and the entire plan for all 9 films. And it's quite amazing to look at how things would have been differently if Kurtz had sort of got his way. I think some of the issues had to do with George Lucas and the business side of it. George Lucas very much was a businessman when it came to Star Wars, and a lot of the decisions he made when you watch the documentaries and stuff did come down to marketing and how to grow the Star Wars brand. There were things that were sacrificed on the altar of that. There just was. I'm not going to go into all of them, but you can watch those old documentaries. So Gary Kurtz was the producer of A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back. He spoke at a sci-fi expo in Plano, Texas about these things. So back in the early 70s, Kurtz was looking to use the new Technoscope technology in an upcoming film, and Francis Ford Coppola hooked him up with George Lucas, who had recently filmed THX 1138 with the Technoscope. Kurtz became interested in Lucas's planned American Graffiti, and they became partners. And when the time came to produce Return of the Jedi, Kurtz was unhappy with the story direction Lucas was taking. He felt it was too much of a rehash of the first films, with no real challenges, and at the same time, Jim Henson was inviting him to produce his experimental film Dark Crystal, which he chose instead. Dark Crystal is actually a really cool movie. It's all puppets and stuff, but they did a really good job if you haven't seen that, and it freaked me out as a kid as well. And so Kurtz didn't really like The Phantom Menace all that much. So now let's get into, this is before they changed anything. This was like the basic, what the story was meant to be originally. So episode 1 was to focus on the origins of the Jedi Knights and how they are initiated and trained. That's interesting. So episode 1 became far more about trade federations and separatists and Anakin as a kid, Vader as a kid. So George really changed that up, and I think a lot of that had to do with, this is my guess, I don't know, but a lot of that had to do with the marketability of Darth Vader. He turned him into Space Jesus because he was the most popular villain in the history of film. You know, it was extremely marketable to focus on Darth Vader, even in episode 1. Lots of people would argue that they should have just started with Anakin as an older guy, and actually that's kind of Kurtz's what he said was the initial plan. So definitely episode 1 was very, very different than what he originally said. Then episode 2 was supposed to be the introduction and development of Obi-Wan Kenobi. So Obi-Wan Kenobi wasn't even supposed to be in episode 1. Very, very interesting change. According to Kurtz, the entire second episode was more of a focus on Obi-Wan Kenobi and developing his story. And of course, what we got was quite different from that. Obi-Wan Kenobi's obviously in it, and he's in it a lot, but most of the focus had to do with his and Anakin's relationship and him training Anakin and all of that stuff. And then episode 3 was supposed to be the introduction and life of Darth Vader. So that tells me that Darth Vader was initially supposed to just be Darth Vader. There wasn't supposed to be this story about Anakin becoming Darth Vader and Space Jesus and all that stuff and the prophecy and all that stuff. That was added after the fact. So of course, episode 4, there were 7 different drafts of the film, and at one point they pursued buying the rights to Hidden Fortress because of the strong similarities. At one point, Luke was a female. Luke's father was in prison, and the film featured 40 Wookiees. So that's a very, very different. They ended up choosing, making Chewie basically the dog of the family, right? So episode 5, once written, the screenplay of Empire is almost exactly what is seen on screen. The only cutscenes were those involving Wampas and the Rebel base and stuff like that. I guess there's a couple more Luke and Yoda training bits that they took out, but there you go. So Empire Strikes Back was basically exactly the way it was supposed to be, other than maybe some more Wampas, I guess. So this is where it gets really interesting to me, guys. This is where it gets really interesting, and I'd love to hear your comments about what you think about this, and if you think this would have been better. After Empire Strikes Back, then Leia was going to be elected the queen of her people. So she would be off on a totally different storyline in what became Return of the Jedi, right? She becomes queen, and that's when you get into more of the political side. So she's isolated over here. Han was meant to die, which is what Harrison Ford really wanted. And then Luke fights Vader. I don't know if Vader survives. I don't think he does. And then Luke goes on to his own storyline at the end of episode 6. And Leia was not his sister. And we obviously have this confirmed because they literally kiss, and Leia and Luke have a little bit of a sort of romancy feel to them. And then, of course, there's the kiss in Empire Strikes Back. So this was clearly what their plan was originally. And then, of course, what Kurtz says is that is that George Lucas changed it and kind of rushed the storyline with the Emperor, and we'll get into that in a sec here. So episode 7 was to focus on Luke specifically as a Jedi, and there wasn't a whole lot of details, but he was going to go and search for his sister because he finds out that he's got a sister, same as he does in what was released with Obi-Wan telling him and all that stuff, and so he goes to go find her. So that's a completely different situation than we got, right? Luke isn't even in episode 7 in the Disney trilogy. He's on an island basically by himself. So the third trilogy would focus on Luke's life as a Jedi. In episode 8, Luke would find his sister. They kind of join together in this task to deal with the Emperor. So the Emperor is still there. The Empire is still there. It didn't get destroyed. Like what Disney did with Jakku and all that stuff. They changed it. Like in the EU, there's still war going on for 30 years. So you have a lot of stories there, whereas Disney, for some unknown reason, decided to just have the Empire completely fold in episode 7. After episode 6 of the Battle of Jakku, whatever it was, like a year later. It's in the Aftermath book or whatever. But then still had the Emperor come back and then still had the First Order. So it's like they didn't even really realize what they were wanting to do. Whereas the initial storyline was that Luke was going to go and he was going to find his sister. Then they're going to come back. And then in episode 9 was actually going to be the first time you physically see the Emperor. So he's in holograms and stuff, but you wouldn't actually have seen him until the end of episode 9. And Luke and his sister were going to take him on and defeat him once and for all, right? That's very different from the EU. That's very different than what George decided he wanted to go see. What happened was George wanted the story to be about Vader's grandkids. So he wanted it to be about like 3 generations and 3 trilogies. And most of that had to do with the marketability of Vader and how people were just all about Vader. Then he turned the prequels into a story about Anakin becoming Vader rather than Vader already being who he was in episode 3. He would be introduced. He wouldn't even have been in episode 1 and 2. And then he switched the episodes, the third trilogy, episode 7 to 9, from a story about Luke to a story about the grandkids more. And you saw that in the EU with Solo twins, and then Luke had a family, although, of course, George Lucas has said Luke would never have had any kids. So what do you guys think about this? This is a completely different trilogy. Personally, obviously, I like the ideas of the sequel trilogy far better than what Disney gave us, obviously. Having the story more focused on Luke and stuff. But what do you guys think? I mean, do you think that would have been better or worse? Like, especially when it comes to Return of the Jedi, like that would have completely changed the whole situation. If the Emperor wasn't even in Return of the Jedi, it was more about just Luke confronting Vader without the Emperor, and then having the Emperor still around and still doing stuff and still running his empire, and the war still going on heavily throughout the sequel trilogy. Obviously, that's better than what Disney gave us because that's totally discombobulated. But what do you guys think in the comment section? Would you have thought that this was kind of a cool idea? Do you like the idea of Leia not being Luke's sister, which of course was the original plan, and that he would go seek out his sister, help train her, whatever? They come back as, I guess, essentially the Ben and Rey to fight the Emperor like they did on Exegol, except their brother-sister, and it's Luke and his sister. So what do you guys think? Let me know in the comment section if you like this idea, and what do you think about how George Lucas just like completely changed it up and made it all about Anakin? And then, of course, Disney did the same thing with the sequels, having Ben Solo like obsessed with his grandfather and all that stuff and pretending to be like Vader and all that stuff. What do you guys think? Would you guys have preferred this? Do you think what they ultimately did in the first 6 movies was still better than what this original thought process was? And any other comments you have about this? I just find this extremely interesting. And this is actually, Gary Kurtz revealed all this. I believe it was back in 1999. I could be wrong on that. Check me on that. But I think it was back in 1999. And this was before 1980 that they had these original intentions for the 9 films. So let me know what you think in the comment section. Thanks for watching. If you do like this content, please like and subscribe. Always helps the channel. And check out my other Star Wars content and have yourselves a really good day.